Good morning, everybody. How are we doing today? It is a Friday morning. Got a long day ahead of me today. The cable net cup is back in the mix. Good cup of Joe, an essential to a Good Morning America. One of my favorite lines from Twin Peaks: Fire Walk with Me. You want a cup of Good Morning America? Great dark film, David Lynch, of course. Today I want to talk about something that I've discussed over the years on my channel, but I just feel like it's time to talk about it again. I don't like dive too deep into it. But running a jazz-inflected coffee shop. And mind you, I don't play just jazz. I play some soul and blues and R&B, and I mean, it just depends on what mood I'm in, time of day, what's it like outside. There's lots of different music I'll play. Classic rock. I mean, I played some New Order the other day, which is really fun. Amy Winehouse the other day. The New Order Substance 2 LP set. A great collection of New Order's work after Ian Curtis and Joy Division dissolved. Ian Curtis' passing was... has there ever been a band in the history of pop music whose direction changed more based off one member passing? And obviously Curtis was a huge part of what Joy Division was. But post Joy Division New Order, it's a whole different sound. They go from being dark, I mean, the Bauhaus, new wave, it's not really punk, but it's really dark. It's not super melodic. In places it is atmosphere and ceremony, a couple songs, but I mean, a lot of it's very monotone. The singing's not great, but it's got a depth to it and a darkness and a desperation and a seeking and a pleading and a hurting that's tangible. And I wouldn't put Joy Division's work up against Tears for Fears' first record, or second record for that matter. But, I mean, it's still an important part of the British post-punk development of the alternative scene. And boy, New Order is a whole different thing, though. It's Euro dance club, LGBT themed. I mean, it just feels very different in every way. And I love Bernard Sumner. I love a lot of those New Order singles. They're pretty fantastic stuff. And everybody, of course, knows Blue Monday. Blue Monday's been covered a few different times. But, I mean, so we do play a lot of different stuff in the cafe, is my point. But I can't tell how many times people have come in and said to me, oh, I don't like jazz. It's too difficult. It's too frenetic. It's too hard to listen to. It's too hard to comprehend. And, boy, that just sticks in my craw. Just irks me. Because that aspect of jazz is but a leaf on the tree of jazz. I mean, it was the pop and dance music of this country for 2 generations. There's so much wonderful, accessible, melodic, beautiful, blues-inflected, gospel-filled soul music. I mean, jazz is such a universal thing. It's so not pigeonholed into what so many of the public's perception of jazz is. How did we get there? How did we have a consciousness and a stream that exists outside of the jazz world that so misconstrues, and its misconceptions of jazz are so great? I mean, there's probably fields that are somewhat like this. Maybe the ufologists, the study of unidentified flying objects, and the mass perception in public of how that's always about aliens. I mean, that's not the same thing. But I think that's not even comparable in a way to the misconceptions that exist out there about what jazz is, how jazz sounds, how difficult jazz is to listen to. And it bothers me because so little of the jazz canon reflects that. Yet so much of what the critics and the YouTube channels and the Facebook groups and the monocle wearing I'm so sophisticated motherfuckers, all they ever do is profess, oh, I so get it. I listen to the deepest, darkest jazz. I'm so abstract. It tells you how complex I am, doesn't it? And boy, that pisses people off when I say it, but we do try to listen to things in part by how we think other people are going to perceive us. I mean, we're all guilty of it at some point, at some age, in some part of our development, part of our jazz journey, and this exists well outside of jazz. I mean, a lot of the kids who associate with punk, they want to be seen as a punker, not necessarily that they love Dead Kennedys. It's not necessarily that the Misfits speaks to them, but it's about associating and affiliating with an identity. And I think a lot of us can look at a punker and be like, oh, they're just trying to belong to a niche, a crowd. They want to fit in somewhere. I mean, a lot of the way white kids in America love hip-hop, or at least used to, I think it's kind of changing nowadays. It's about identifying with a rebellious part of society and being outside of your parents' comfort zone. So we always, throughout our life and development, are listening to music that's about how people are going to perceive me. What's my identity? And a lot of these people who think they're so sophisticated and so modern and there's an air about them, they don't think that they're guilty of that. They just get it. And they would never admit that part of why they listen to jazz is because they like to think that people think they're so sophisticated because they get Alice Coltrane. It's so fucking nonsense. And the same fucking people are the same ones who go, oh, I don't like Dave Brubeck. Oh, I don't like Organ or Jimmy Smith. I mean, it's fucking insanity. It's so obvious you posturing and trying to look and fit and be something that you think is elitist and so sophisticated and so debonair. And boy, people are going to think I'm so hip and modern. And most people find you pretentious, to be honest, just so you know. I'll be the one to tell you. Jazz Sharp is going to let you know that when you put on that screeching, awful shit, no one's going, whoa, man, boy, I wish I could be more like them. They're thinking, God, this guy thinks he's so fucking cool. What a fucking dipshit. That's what they're thinking. And I like much of the avant-garde. I like some free jazz. I like some spiritual jazz, although I think all jazz is spiritual, especially the early blues and gospel-inflected jazz. It's far more spiritual than a lot of the supposed spiritual jazz music. And that stuff has a time and place. But if that's all you're professing, if that's all you're identifying with, and it's preposterous, and you've really misrepresented jazz to your friends and your family and your wife, and every episode you make on your YouTube channel, you're misrepresenting this music because it's a very small part of what jazz is. And it's just frustrating how many people come in with such closed minds to this music. And that's the largest reason why. And such a high percentage of the jazz kingdom is guilty of this. Oh, I just love the sophisticated, difficult. Where's my monocle, man? Cecil Taylor, I love it. I mean, you're not impressing anybody. I mean, your wife leaves the room every time for a reason. And I don't want to get too deep down this wormhole, but it just really frustrates me how people come in with such a misconception of what jazz is and how they think they can ever like it or listen to it. And that's a problem. It's partly why this music has such a small audience, is the perceptions and misconceptions of what this music is. So fucking stop. Stop acting like you're too cool to listen to Brubeck. Stop acting like, oh, you're too hip for fucking organ jazz. You're too cool for Shelly Manne. It's fucking embarrassing. And you embarrass yourself and you look like a pretentious fucking fool. And in the bathtub today, where a lot of my epiphanies seem to come over the course of my lifetime. Epiphanal bathtub revelations is what I should call this channel. But I had a great parallel that I think mirrors what this preposterousness looks like. The Beatles, one of the incredible artists of any century, one of the great songwriting duos, really they all were songwriters. None of them are great musicians in their own right. McCartney's a pretty fantastic musician. I mean, John and George had their moments, but it was them as a unit, and obviously with George Martin's oversight and direction, they composed and arranged one of the most wonderful pieces of music that in some ways defines pop music, but it also elevates it and it rises above what pop music is. The Beatles stuff is infinite. It's going to be eternal. It's going to be around for millennia. Believe that. And let's for a second imagine that 95% of the people you met said, I don't like the Beatles. I find it hard to listen to. And their only conception of what the Beatles is was Revolution number 9. Number 9. Turn me on, Deadman. Turn me on, Deadman. Whoa. I mean, I love Revolution number 9. Spent a lot of days doing LSD to that. If I listen to it, I can almost feel the tingle of the LSD in my spine. Like it takes me back. I have nostalgic connections to that song. And it's partly what opened my mind up to the avant-garde. I mean, the Beatles were mind-altering, and you drive into Floyd and Astronomy Domine and or Domine, however you want to say that, and Interstellar Space, and all those early Floyd psychedelic records, and the Grateful Dead, Live Dead, and I mean, I went down that wormhole, and all of a sudden you're listening to Coltrane's Ohm and Pharoah Sanders, and you think you're just. But imagine if the Beatles were known primarily for Revolution number 9. And that's what most people's perception of what the Beatles was. Wouldn't that kind of irk you a little bit? You're like, man, there's so much more to the Beatles than Revolution number 9. I mean, I can't think of a better parallel in terms of how I see and feel about. And remember, folks, I have the jazz canon. I'm obsessive compulsive. I'm OCD. I have most jazz labels from the 50s, 60s completed. Everything they put out. So I've heard more than most people, including most jazz critics, including most jazz YouTube channels, including most jazz experts. I've heard more of the jazz canon, what was released. I'm not just collecting the tone poets. I'm not just collecting the new classic reissues. I'm not just collecting the CD reissues. I have most jazz labels' entire discographies. So I can tell you how small a part Revolution 9 is to the rest of the jazz canon. I know. I'm not just speaking out of turn. And that's not even to really factor in all the jazz from the 20s and the 30s and the 40s that came out on 78 RPM, much of which was canonized onto LP eventually. The important stuff was especially. And there's different labels like Olympic and Smithsonian that reissued a lot of that early stuff from the 78 RPM era onto LP. So I do have a lot of that stuff. But there's a lot of stuff from the 78 RPM that slipped through the cracks and didn't get reissued. There's stuff from the 10-inch LP era that didn't get reissued on the 12-inch LP. So the 12-inch LP isn't exactly the entire... And I have so much of the 10-inch era library now as well. I keep filling those in as well because I think it's such an interesting time in music industry, that switch from 78 to 10-inch 33 to 12-inch 33. It really creates a lot of ebb and flux and flow in the industry and the artists, and it's a rapid time of change post-war. So it's really interesting stuff. But again, it's just a great way to see how I see this conundrum. Revolution 9, representing the Beatles' body of work, is a great parallel to screeching, honking, dissonant jazz being what jazz is. Thankfully, the Beatles don't have to worry about that misconception because that's not the perception. In fact, few Beatles fans, I mean, real Beatles fans know Revolution 9, but the average person who's like, oh yeah, I like the Beatles, probably has never heard Revolution number 9. People don't listen to whole albums nowadays. They don't collect the records. They just stream whatever's hot on there. And so, I mean, they've heard My Michelle, they've heard In My Life, and they've heard With a Little Help from My Friends, and they've heard Blackbird, but they probably haven't heard Revolution number 9. And it's a really interesting piece. I do enjoy it still, if I'm in the mood for it. And again, it's mostly a nostalgic thing to me. And I can still do avant-garde free jazz when I'm in the mood for it, when it matches my tone, when it matches the intensity of my frame, what I'm doing. I mean, there's a place and a time for all things. But this perception that all jazz is that has to stop. And if you're the one out there professing this stuff to your friends and your family and your channel and your YouTube and your Facebook, you're part of the problem. This music will die a slow, painful death unless we get people to remember Bill Holiday and Ella Fitzgerald are jazz. Shelly Manne is jazz. Dave Brubeck, sorry, that's jazz. And the stuff that was labeled avant-garde, free jazz, and all the other stuff that came even later, it was given those names because it was a branch on the tree that very much deviates from the trunk. So how does some fucking little leaf way on the edge of that tree define the entire fucking tree? And I've had to change so many people's minds and perceptions about jazz when they've come in and show them some of the beauty and the groove and the love and the accessibility and the spirituality of 95% of the jazz canon. And such a small percentage of it is that largely unlistenable to the average person aspect of jazz. And yet, that notion just persists. I've been doing my channel for 5 years, and I'm sure I've swayed a few minds and opened up a few doors. And I know I've influenced people on some level, and people see labels differently now because of a lot of what I've preached over the years. And I know people have learned to love the Bethlehem label. I've had a lot of people tell me that they've looked to me as the person that inspired them to either collect labels or to collect the artists that are on Bethlehem, or a lot of different labels. I mean, I've opened that door to people going, if it's on that label, it's worth collecting. And so I know I've had some impact. But God, that perception still persists so strongly. And I fight it and I struggle with it all the time running a jazz cafe. And I just wish people would ease up on some of what they profess. And recognize that they're doing damage to the body of this work by struggling so hard to make themselves look cool. And you're not even doing that. I'm a whole lot more impressed with a 28-year-old dude saying, oh man, I love Ella Fitzgerald's songbooks, than I am with a guy saying, man, I dug Archie Shepp last night for 10 hours. I mean, the Archie Shepp, that's kind of expected of you because that's who you are trying to be perceived as. The Ella shows me, oh man, you've grown up quick. You get it. And these same people will kind of denigrate the Jimmy Smiths and sometimes even the Charlie Parkers and Dizzy Gillespie's, and they think they're such experts and know so much about it. And I don't really like jazz before 19. I mean, you don't really like jazz when it was really jazz, is what you're saying. It's very disappointing. And obviously my channel reaches a small segment of the population. So I'm not going to be out there changing and switching people's minds like the general public who doesn't watch YouTube channels. And that's generally who's coming in going, oh, I never really liked jazz, but this is good. What is this? I'm like, well, that's actually what jazz is. And the other shit you don't like. And I mean, Hollywood's to blame for it to some degree. Television shows, a lot of times when they use some dissonant jazz in a film, they kind of are projecting that very thing. A pretentious white asshole who his asshole is so tight it whistles when he farts. I mean, I've seen them use that in television and film 100 times when they're trying to paint somebody as a pretentious dickhead. And that's exactly what they use. Some guy sitting there reading the New York Times, listening to... And that's what you want to be it. But just shut up about it and do it on your own time. Let people enjoy this music. What we're listening to right now, by the way, is some great jazz. Paul Smith, and I think I showed you this a few weeks ago, maybe a month ago. Paul Smith is a great West Coast piano player. This is on the Skylark label, which was the same label founder as the guy who ran Tampa Records. And much of what ended up in Skylark as a 10-inch gets reissued on Tampa as an LP. Almost always with different covers. Oftentimes they even switch who the leader of the session was to try to repackage it as a different session. I mean, a lot of scandalous shit like that goes on in the Jazz Kingdom on a pretty regular basis. I mean, there's a few exceptions to it. Blue Note's the one who didn't really do that kind of nonsense. Bob Weinstock, he sure did it at Prestige. Norman Granz, to some degree, he does it. He repackages a lot of stuff with different covers on a regular basis. Let's dive into a few things, though, and move on. A wonderful record here, Thad Jones. One of the first LPs issued by Blue Note as a 12-inch LP. And I was talking to my friend Mike Munson, the great blues players, in here last week. And I told him this is probably one of the first sessions recorded as an LP session by Blue Note. It's 1513 in the 1500 series, 55. And I think almost everything before this, except for maybe one title, 1512 by Jimmy Smith, was all called from 78 and 10-inch era recordings. It's J.J. Johnson, Miles Davis, Thelonious Monk, Kenny. I mean, all that early stuff before this was all repackagings of earlier stuff because the new format was going to be the new way the industry was going forward. But this session, this is its first release on LP. And when you look at the length of the sides, I have a sneaking suspicion this might have been recorded to be a 10-inch. But then ended up getting released as an LP as that format change happened. Because they are short sides. I mean, there's 2.5 songs on that side, 2 songs on this side. And it plays rather briefly. So my guess is this could have been meant to be a 10-inch when it was recorded, but ended up getting reissued on the LP format. This is the Classic Records reissue. Beautiful, beautiful pressing. Before the Tone Poet repressings, these classic pressings from the late 90s, early 2000s were the go-to pressing for Blue Note. They really did a nice job recreating the shiny lacquered covers, the back covers, everything's done very much in sync with how it originally looked. There's no barcodes added. The LP themselves, I mean, everything is done very much in a vintage context, which is a nice way to present it. Great sounding stuff, again, for those pressing audiophile people, the Classic Records. People always say they sound delicious. I have no stake in that game. I think most jazz LPs, regardless of pressing, are going to sound fairly similar to the average person. And I've said that before, and someone's going to be like, oh my god, I can't believe you fucking... But to the average person, they're not going to sound dramatically different. No matter what, I mean, most people can't tell a Scorpio from a classic record from a Tone Poet. Most people. And the people who are listening to that stuff are often missing music because they're listening to that stuff, which is also ridiculous. Great cover. Kenny Burrell's on this, who's really fantastic. I really enjoyed his playing. And it says Detroit, New York Junction. And part of that's because you have a lot of Detroit guys in here with Thad Jones, Kenny Burrell, Tommy Flanagan, and the great Billy Mitchell on the tenor, who should have gotten more work as a leader. He's really under-recognized as a leader. And he shows up quite a bit with these Detroit guys in that period. I guess 2 albums as a leader on the Smash label, which is affiliated with Emerson Mercury, if I remember. And those are good titles. You should look for those. You can find those 2 Billy Mitchell titles on Smash, which James Brown put a lot of stuff out on that label eventually, too. But a great recording. And then the rhythm section here, at least the bass player and drummer, Pettiford and Wilson, are New York guys. Burrell really does shine out. And my friend Mike Munson, the blues guy, he was like, man, Burrell's great on that. And I'm like, boy, he really is. Another great record here, again with Kenny Burrell featured, is Wynton Kelly. This is on a Riverside, number 254, probably puts it in 1956, maybe early 57. Kenny Burrell, Paul Chambers, and Philly Joe Jones, so it's a quartet setting. A young Wynton Kelly before he joins Miles Davis's group. One of the great piano players of this time, real R&B gospel inflected, a lot of soul in his playing, real spiritual, guided, emotional player, not an intellectual player. And Miles Davis was known to have quoted as saying he felt so comfortable leaving the stage when Wynton Kelly was up there leading the charges. Kelly was just a wonderful leader with his playing. I don't think he was a vocal leader in terms of that type of leadership, but as a player on stage, he could really command his group and an audience. This is a Japanese pressing on the Milestone reissue label. And what I find frustrating about this title is it's really hard to find an old Riverside copy of this. I've looked over the years, I haven't looked recently, maybe there's one out there now, but I keep finding this in these Japanese Milestone. I'm guessing Milestone probably bought Riverside at one point. Then was Milestone also Or Keep News? It's possible. But, and sometimes the Japanese will put a later label on, because that's who ended up owning it. I mean, you see some of the stuff like on Transition end up having Blue Note labels, because Blue Note bought some of that stuff and issued it. But Kelly's just fantastic. And again, Burrell's wonderful on here. And Chambers and Philly Joe are just one of the great seminal rhythm sections of that era. The great Dick Johnson, who is a very under-heralded player. This is also on Riverside number 253. So again, probably late 56, early 57. Let's see. But a nice record with Philly Joe, Wilbur Ware on the bass, the great Chicago bass player. Dave McKenna's on the piano, who's got some really cool work on ABC, actually, ABC Paramount. But he's an alto player, most likely Dick Johnson. Kind of a bit of a cornball cover. Riverside's covers can be a little bit hit or miss at times. And honestly, this cover is quite misleading. It makes you think it's going to be schlocky and vocal, but it's actually a fantastic jazz record and very pure. And he's a really great player who emulates a lot of the great alto players of that time. So moving on here, we got the great Dexter Gordon. I don't think I showed this last episode, but if I did, oh well. Classic cover, one of the great covers in jazz history. Back when cigarette smoking was glamorous. Hard to believe that was ever a thing. On a very small West Coast label, Due To, which ended up getting renamed Dutone or vice versa. Very seldom does a guy have one of his most signature recordings on a label as insignificant as Due To. It was a very small, short-run label. There's a Carl Perkins. There's the great bass player has a record on there. I can't think of his name right now. I can see the cover, kind of a spacesuit. But anyway, Dexter Gordon. This is kind of one of his returns to the scene. The great piano player Carl Perkins is on this, not the rock and roll guy. Perkins had a very disformed hands from polio. Great player. Really a revelation how interesting a guy that guy was. But Dexter's just in a beautiful lyrical form here. He's playing with West Coast cats, and of course Dexter was mostly a West Coast cat, played on Central Avenue in New York a lot. Leroy Vinegar's also on this. That could be actually who had that record. Jimmy Robinson's on the trumpet, and Chuck Thompson's on the drums. Fantastic, cool meets post-bop. I mean, it's definitely a little bit more intense than your average cool record, with a lot of blues, a lot of soul. But that's how Perkins rolls. We had an interesting guy I met last week in here, last Tuesday I think it was. Monday actually, and he was a B3 player, and we were talking about the development of the B3 in jazz and how much Jimmy Smith changed that landscape. And we pulled this out. It was on the Regent label, and Regent was a label out of New Jersey that Savoy ended up buying at one point. And Savoy kind of kept the two entities separate for most of the 78 RPM era, 10-inch LP. But sometime in 53, 54, they ingrain Regent more into the Savoy fold, and they start putting their own recordings out on Regent. And Regent actually has some great jazz recordings in 57, 56, 58. There's some really good titles there on Regent. 60, 50, this is 6004. So this is the early 78 RPM recordings here of Bill Bucker, Bobby Banks, and Vince Strong, three organ players called together onto an LP. The Savoy Regent art department left a lot to be desired. Very interesting but simple graphics. Nostalgic. I mean, it takes you back to piano books in my grandparents' piano bench back in the day. It's got that kind of same look, but not the graphic design of what was happening at Norman Grand's, Verve and Clef and Norgran. Certainly not what Bethlehem was doing with Burt Goldblatt and other labels like Roost. There was a lot of design happening in jazz in 53, 54, 55, and Regent / Savoy was not part of that cusp. They were very much behind that curve. But to listen to these guys playing organ pre-Jimmy Smith, and to then hear Jimmy Smith, it's as great a development in an instrument as Hawkins on the tenor, Armstrong on the trumpet, Parker on the alto, Kenny Clark on the drums. Every guy that came along innovates and kind of shifts and changes what the instrument did. I don't think anybody can really lay claim to doing it more so than what Jimmy Smith did. Boy, does he shake the foundations of what the organ can be. And it was very much an accompanying instrument. Played a lot of gospels and blues, the Black Church. So it was hitting comp chords in the background, the bass pedals and stuff. And it was a wonderful way to fill up a room with one instrument. But it was never really seen as a soloing instrument. A single note, virtuosity-filled instrument. And Jimmy Smith locked himself up in a warehouse, I think in 54. And he spent 12 months in that warehouse with a B3 and came out and started issuing some incredible recordings on Blue Note. And he single-handedly helps launch Blue Note into a mode of survival that Blue Note would not have had sans Jimmy Smith. Blue Note almost sold to Atlantic in 54, 55. Atlantic almost bought them out, in part because of the switch from the 78 to the 10-inch era. Cost money, you had to buy new stock, new pressing. It was an expensive venture to make that switch. And then the big labels go to the 12-inch LP, and these small labels had just spent all this money and investment going to 10-inch LP. And so for a lot of these small labels, making that switch kills a lot of small labels, which I'm sure the big labels had no problem with. I mean, they don't mind cleaning up some of the excess trash out there that's making small independent music. But Jimmy Smith signing the Blue Note ends up being a huge factor in why Blue Note does what it does. And it's the success of Jimmy Smith's records and how well they sell that allows the Mobleys and the Morgans and the Jazz Messengers and the Horace Silvers and the hosts of other great recordings that happen at Blue Note that are predominantly hard bop driven, incredibly socially conscious records. It's Jimmy Smith that really allows that window to remain open for one of the greatest labels of all time to record and document the place and time that Black American youth were coming through the civil rights era and demanding through their art justice and freedom and liberty. And Jimmy Smith gets so little credit. I mean, some of the most important recordings in jazz. He's the Charlie Parker of his instrument. He is a landmark player. And one of the things about Jim Smith is I think a lot of times people too often will hear his later Verve recordings that has Claus Ogerman and some of those other Ranger guys, Oliver Nelson, putting all kinds of arrangement stuff over top of his playing, watering down Jimmy Smith's bop, hard bop, bebop stylings. And his signing with Verve, while good for his career financially, is rather destructive artistically. And it was also really devastating to Blue Note to lose Jimmy Smith in 61. No, probably even earlier than that. Probably like 60. He signs with Verve, and again, that's Creed Taylor's doing. Creed Taylor leaves ABC Impulse and goes to the Verve. MGM buys Verve from Norman Granz, and kind of almost forces Norman Granz out, forces a lot of his musicians off the label. Creed Taylor comes in, they go to the deluxe gatefolds, the new art department, all new artists, and they got musicians from so many small labels. Bill Evans from Riverside, Wes Montgomery from Riverside, Cal Jader. I mean, it just go down that list. You look at all the recordings on Verve, 62, 63, 64, Kenny Burrell. There's just so many guys that came from small labels that Creed Taylor signs away. And it really hurts a lot of the small jazz labels around at the time. And sadly, very few of them make recordings at Verve for Creed Taylor that rival what they were doing earlier on small labels. In part because the Sebesky, the Mitch, the Oliver Nelson, all these records, all these big arrangements on them, and the arrangements are stifling, and they're canned, and they're meant for white audiences that were living in the suburbs, driving a station wagon to the supermarket, coming home, putting on a lovely lacquered gatefold jazz record that was very accessible and easy to listen to. And I mean, almost every one of them. I mean, Wes Montgomery ends up doing California Dreaming and Tequila, and they're not bad recordings, but they're just not as blues and as gospel and as soulful. They're good listening, but they're easy listening. I mean, there's not the same level of digestion and fortitude in those recordings, sadly. And so when you listen to Jimmy Smith, especially his 55 through 58, 59 body of work, which is immense. In the first 100 Blue Notes, there's like 20-some Jimmy Smith records. So every 3-4 titles, they were putting out a Jimmy Smith or two. Like, he was really prolific. Blue Note was relying on his sales. A lot of the stuff hasn't been reissued, in part because it's sold fairly well. A lot of his records are still out there. You can buy original Jimmy Smith pressings for not landmark money, unlike the Mobleys and the Morgans and the Ike Quebecs and some of those records, which are so expensive. Smith's records stay in part because there's more of them out there. Three Sounds, same thing. There's a lot of Three Sounds records out there. They sold well. And those records never get reissued because there's just too many used copies out there to be had for 20, 30, 40 bucks. But that doesn't make them not good. Again, going back to what I said at the beginning of this episode, some of those records that sold well because they were good and they were accessible and they were fun to listen to. And if they were recorded on small labels especially, they're going to be filled with authentic and genuine expression of a man's soul and his life's condition. What more can you ask for in your art? What more can you want from your music than a guy being honest and inflecting and sharing his life's experiences through the expression of innovation and improvisation that comes through emoting in the art form known as jazz. The coolest art form mankind has ever invented is jazz music. And the fact that so many shun it and are afraid of it and don't think it's for them, when in so many ways so much of it everybody could enjoy. The onus is on us as jazz fans to stop that noise, to stop that perception. I challenge every one of you to stop sounding critical of jazz that's accessible so people will think you're cool, because it's not cool. It's the opposite of cool. And I try not to get too worked up about it, because I used to get really worked up about it a couple of years ago, and people would ban me and not watch my channel and all that. And so I'm trying not to be too polarizing about it. But I mean, it still irks me. It still drives me nuts how few of these people really have enough knowledge to be talking like experts, first of all. If you have 50, 60, 100, 200 jazz records, you don't know enough to know anything. You just know enough to be dangerous. So shut the fuck up. You know what I mean? At best, you're just repeating and regurgitating other people's pablum. Not a lot of nourishment in that. Get to the point where you have enough records and enough insight and enough perspective from many different points in the jazz story to have some perspective to talk about it. And I hope I can do that. And I'm not saying I know it all and I'm the most important. I just have my opinions and my perceptions of things, and I try to share them in my evangelical kind of way because I'm a preacher's kid after all. But most importantly, I want people to love this art form. I want people to come in here and embrace the warm waves and sounds that the black community created to help them overcome tyranny. The politics, the social issues, all of it is wrapped up in the beauty of melody and rhythm and spirituality and consciousness, and it's the entire total human package in an art form. How cool is that? And so let's not make our entire emotional register be one emotion, which is so much of what the avant-garde and free jazz reflects. Dissonance, chaos, intensity, all of which has its moments and points, and some of it's more accessible and better than some other stuff. But it's just enough's enough. Let's make this art form lovable. That's on you. It's on you, jazz fan, to make people love this music. And if you want to like something that's difficult, by all means, feel free to love it. And I love a lot of things that I don't play for people. I'm not interested in how I make them think about me. I want to make them think something about this music. My years of trying to make people have an impression of who I am are over. I don't give a fuck. I am who I am. I love who I am. I mean, this is me. But loving jazz, to me, that's important. And as Americans here in this country, we should cherish this art form. It's an important part of our legacy. It's an important part of our history. It's a story that needs to be told. I do appreciate everybody who has helped support the channel. I could use a few new Patreon supporters. Please go to my Patreon and pledge, $5, $10 a month. That does help. I've lost some Patreon supporters the last few months. I don't make episodes as often as I used to. I've had a lot on my plate with the live music, and I'm doing trivia here. And there's a lot of things going on, so I only so many hours in the day. But I do appreciate those who have supported. If you want to throw me a one-time donation, in my page there's a link to PayPal. You can do a super thanks on YouTube itself. But we do need support. We do need to help keep this cafe going. This is a jazz temple. And you're not throwing money at me for me to go out and drink beer. I don't drink anymore. I'm sober 4 years. You're throwing money at me to help me keep this place going. And I'd like to be able to make enough money to someday start buying more jazz records to help fill in some of the gaps I still have. I mean, there's not a lot. But there is stuff I still would like to collect. Most of it's stuff that's 10-inch LP era, a lot of which was already reissued on LP that I have. But it's still fun to get the 10-inch stuff to document it and know the history so I can speak about it as fluently as possible. And so I can be as candid and as reflective and as be able to connect the dots and see somebody, oh, that's this and this was reissued as that. I think that's valuable to know that stuff. And oftentimes, even though it can help you know there's an affordable way to buy that. If you buy that on the LP, it's only going to cost you half what the 10-inch will, vice versa. So, again, please support the channel in any way you can. If you want merchandise, message me. There is a link below, but I also have some merchandise here in the store that's different that I can ship to you. You can send me money through PayPal. So, whatever you can. And I don't like to ask for money. It's not what I'm here to do. I'm not one of those get-rich schemed YouTubers. I'm here to share a message. But the message does need to have money to support this, to keep this all going. And the fact of the matter is I live upstairs, so if I lose the business, I lose my home as well, which means I probably lose my record collection. So if you want to see this place preserved, and this channel preserved, and this collection to remain in place, please help me out. Money has been tight. We're doing the best we can. And I love you all. Y'all stay safe. Love that jazz above all. Jazz will save you. Jazz will give you what you need to get through at any time. Peace.